So, and then in case we have something to chat or comment, ask about, I have the new recording on. Thank you for coming, Doxing Sinhailus. And hello, Private Lexi, new acquaintance. Yesterday, when we were having some pauses in the game, or actually, let's stay here until I have my edge ready. I was talking about the different databases with some information that might be interesting to all of you. So I'd like to show at least one of them now, one that might be particularly interesting to all of you as, if not native English speakers, at least as English speakers of some kind. And this is, thank you for coming, Bunzel, Mighty Germ, Robert Brown. The E-Wave, the Electronic World Atlas of Varieties of English. This is a mechanically similar database to the ethnographic atlas from yesterday. And here we can look up some features. They are numbered and grouped. And you can also find your own variety of English and see what kinds of, let's say Maltese English, for example, what kinds of variations are used in Maltese English. And usually, if you look at the feature, you will have a more or less useful description of how it works. I think in this case the description is not particularly strong. So we have alternative forms for dummy it. So it's raining. In East Anglia you might say das raining. That is raining instead of it is raining. I can clearly understand what this means, but I'm sorry. You should see the browser. I had neglected to click the transition button once again. So here we have the alternative forms for dummy it. And on the map here we can see where this is more common, and the variant A here, pervasive or obligatory, basically means that they always say something else than it's raining. Unfortunately, the legend is not as helpful as it is in the ethnographic atlas. This is not the same thing. This is a similar database, but about a different topic. We were looking at the ethnographic atlas yesterday. So here we can see that there are 4 varieties of English where something different than it is the most common. One of them is East Anglian. Another one is Guyanese Creole. So this is it's a matter of definition if this is actually English at all. I would say not. The Torres Strait Creole is a Creole as well. And Aboriginal English is I think you can actually look up somewhere what the shapes here mean. So in this case the square is a native form of English. The triangles both are Creoles, and the tilted square seems to be some kind of contact language. Then let's turn these off and check in which varieties this is not used at all. This is extremely common, of course. But let's see if, for example, there are some of the B or C varieties in... B is only in Scotland and the Caribbean, but the C, where this exists but is extremely rare, can be found in the US as well. Urban African American English, Rural African American, So again, these are contact languages. And the Southeast American enclave dialects are the only ones that are not spoken by an ethnic minority. I'm not familiar with the dialectology of the United States, so I'm also not familiar with what exactly these dialects are. So let's have a look at it. Noteworthy enclave dialects in North Carolina, produced by centuries of relative isolation, have been the focus of much recent research. These include the dialects spoken on the island of Ocracoke in coastal Hyde County and by the Lumbee Indians. So these seem to be quite likely to be the contact language as well. So let's take a look at the map again, since you were not able to see it. Here we have, you can find a specific kind of English that you are interested in and check what kinds of features it has. Or you can find a specific feature and look up which varieties of English have that. Let's look at something infinite article 1. This is typical of Caribbean Creoles. Let's see if it is in fact to be found in Europe. It exists but is extremely rare in Irish English. Whether or not this means Irish English or Hiberno English, I'm not quite sure. But speaking of, here is something that I can draw a little about. As I'm sure you remember, at least those who have been to most episodes, and the Anglic languages are the ones spoken on the Germanic, on the British Isles. And here we have a split into English and Scots. And later from English we have Scottish English. So there are two varieties, there are two Germanic languages in Scotland which have split from each other at different times. So Scots is the original Germanic language of Scotland. Scottish English is the later. The one, if you hear a Scottish person speaking English and you can tell that they are Scottish, but you can understand it, it is going to be Scottish English. If you, for example, look up a YouTube clip of working class Scottish individuals and you cannot understand a single word or even sound that they are saying, it is likely to be Scots. The situation is relatively similar in Ireland as well, although this split happened later. The older variety of English in Ireland is called Hiberno English, and this is more divergent from English than the next split. This is Irish English, and the reasons for this split are basically historical. So the Hiberno English was created around the year 1000 when the Normans arrived, so immediately after the Norman conquest of England, whereas Irish English was created much later, around the English Civil War, which was when Ireland was extremely brutally made into a functional part of the Kingdom of England. This was also the time period when Irish prisoners of war were enslaved in the Caribbean, if you have heard of that. For example, the folk punk band Flogging Molly has a song about this. But I'm not quite sure if the database here is talking about Hiberno English or Irish English. So here we see again that in America as well, using one as an indefinite particle instead of saying, so as in this example, they saw one green snake instead of saying they saw a green snake. This is again mostly attested in Black English, but is also somewhat to be found in so-called colloquial American English. Let's take a look at this one. This is probably the kind of, mixed urban English that might take some influences from Black English. You are certainly familiar with this kind of colloquial English. A lot of the modern internet slang, for example, also has some kind of a base in Black English, like thick, to mean a busty woman, for example, is an African Americanism. I think lit and dope and that kind of vocabulary are also African Americanisms, but some pieces of grammar can flow into the common vernacular as well. So this was the one for English. I showed the German and French ones yesterday. There is one for Spanish of Spain, European Spanish, but unfortunately that one is a bit out of date, and if I call it up, you will see exactly why. The problem is, no, I never want to translate Consulta Mapas. Where do we find it? Deve installare il plugin de Flash, and of course the Flash plugin has been depreciated entirely, so technically you should not even be able to install it. Thank you, Bravat Lexi and Shinhailos, for your compliments. Is there one for French? I'm curious if it covers the North American varieties. The one that I am familiar with does not. That was the François de nos Régions, which, as I recall, only covers European French, but at least on the online. You can take part in these kinds of questionnaires if you are a Franco-Canadian, but whether or not you can easily find maps or information about Canadian French, I unfortunately don't know. Here we have pomme de terre, the apple of the earth. This is, of course, the potato. Let's take a look at that. Again, I recommend calling up this website with the kind of browser that you commonly use and have some sort of ad blocks installed. I'm using Edge to avoid implicating myself in any way, and unfortunately I don't have any way to shield myself from the ever-present advertisements here. So here we have a map of the different words being used for pomme de terre. There's like 4 Canadian French varieties, but also the American and Caribbean ports were French. The Louisiana French is actually something that would interest me on a conceptual level. I don't think, of course, the list of languages that would interest me is almost unending. It would cover most, if not all, of the world's languages. But unfortunately, I don't think the American French varieties are high enough that I will actually learn them at some point. The Creole situation of Haiti, for example, is probably quite interesting. Actually, once I'm done with this map, I'm going to take a digression from the maps into Creoles in general. Hopefully there is someone present who isn't familiar with the concept. There seems to be some area, yes, in southern Wallonia, you might run into potatoes being called Canada in French. Somewhat bizarre. Yellow boxes, Kartoffel. This is a loanword from German, found in areas quite close to Germany again. Patat is more similar with Spanish and Italian. Interestingly found along the Atlantic seaboard. And then pomme de terre is the standard one, found in large areas of the country. Interestingly, in southern France, the old Occitan areas, you find being called a truffle, tartuflo, or tartifle, which is perhaps somewhat unexpected, but truffles are also something that grows underground, so perhaps that is the connection between these two. So, getting into what or how Creoles work, or let's say, let's start with this, the post-Creole continuum. Would Occitan influence this? Probably not. I don't know what the word in Occitan was, but since the spread doesn't fit the Occitan language area particularly well, it's just a part of it, I think it's probably more likely that it's just a coincidence. So, Creoles in general, or if there are, in short, if someone is present who doesn't know what they are. This is the kind of language that develops from pidgin languages. Pidgin languages are the kind of trade language where you use an extremely simplified grammar and a small amount of words to communicate with someone whose language you don't speak and who doesn't speak your language. But you combine some very simple grammar, probably waving with your hands, and the few words from each language that both of you might know. And in the social circumstances of the Caribbean colonies, slaves were bought in West Africa specifically in a way that as few of them as possible shared the same language, so that they could not effectively plan a revolt. And the end result of this was that the slaves would communicate in a pidgin English with their masters, and largely communicate in a pidgin English with each other as well. And what happens over time is that we don't know what happened at the beginning. It might be that the children learned the languages of their parents, but were not able to use them. So eventually they would stop teaching the language to their children. But in any case, at some point, you develop into a Creole language, where this kind of barely functional trade language has turned into a fully functional language. But the speakers have, in this case, have not learned English, and instead they have created their own branch of English. Many Caribbean Creoles feature grammar and even some words from Western African languages, which is of course an argument for the African languages surviving for a short time in the Americas. So eventually, with standard education and enduring contact with English speakers, the Creoles begin to weaken. So you get this continuum between standard English. The example phrase for this is usually "I was at his house." Question. So the base of a trade language is determined by the more powerful or in trading the more wealthy party. That is likely the case. It of course can happen in any case that is the easiest for the people actually developing the trade language. In the case of the Mediterranean, in the Middle Ages, between the Christian Western Europeans and the Muslim Arabs, the lingua franca, as it came to be called, was actually largely based on the Romance languages, although stereotypically the Arabs would have been the more wealthy ones and the ones with the exotic trade goods that the Europeans wanted. So it might work in one way or the other. Out of the other ones that I can remember, I don't know which was used more. It might have been a question of which is easier to learn for the others as well. For example, it might have been that the Europeans would have had a harder time learning Arabic with its large amount of different guttural sounds that Europeans today find difficult to pronounce. So it might have been easier for the Arabs to learn Romance languages, or it might have even been that the Arabs would have been more familiar with the Romance languages because the classical Mediterranean literature in Latin and Greek survived in the Arab Empire, and so particularly highly educated Arabs might have been even conversant or even fluent in the in some Romance language. Yes, the language of least resistance is probably the best answer for this question. In your opinion, would you consider a common foreigner and convenience store transaction to a pidgin transaction situation? Entirely possible. This is actually something that I have read about in Der Postillon, a satirical newspaper in Germany, and in the German language, of course, similar to The Onion in the United States. And I have not personally noticed this when I order at a kebab shop in German. I identify as using normal German, but the joke here was that the customers speak a sort of pidgin German, and the joke was that the shopkeeper was complaining about the Germans speaking in this kind of baby talk, when he himself, as this character, was highly educated and likely spoke better German than any of them. So probably it would be a question of a specific situation, but as a real-world example, you might run into a pidgin situation in a place like that easily. And at the other end, getting back to the continuum, at the other end you would have the so-called, so to say, pure Creole. As an example, me being to him house. Here you are clearly able to understand what this means, even if you are not able to produce any Caribbean Creole. But you can see that only the house actually shares the same conjugation. The grammatical cases are different, and in this case they have been reduced to the accusative in all cases. And then the verb has been changed and the preposition has been changed as well. And where the continuum comes in is that it's not just a binary choice of one of these variants. Because I'm not an expert on this topic, I can't actually give you the a full table of this, but you would have a variation where you would have, say, 3 or 4 variants between at and to. Some of these would be the same word but pronounced differently. For example, you might have at, or you might have it. So pronounced differently, but basically using the same preposition. And you get surprisingly complex combinations of this. I think if you look up Wikipedia, you will be able to. If you Google post-Creole continuum, you probably will be able to find a table like this. I recall there being one for perhaps the Guianan Creole on YouTube. So you end up with, I think in the case of Guyana, you end up with 18 different levels of how formal you are. These practically get used as a sort of formality scale. So if you are watching TV, the presenters will speak standard German, standard English. And if you are just, farmer buddies having a couple of beers, you probably would be speaking entirely in Creole. And depending on the situation, you would land somewhere along the continuum. So that was the Creole talk. These kinds of Creoles exist for English, French, I think Spanish as well, although I'm not familiar with any Spanish ones. There are some of these in Africa and Southeastern Asia as well. I think there are even some based on German, in Namibia, for example. In the case of Namibia, it is called Küchendeutsch, so kitchen German, but I'm not familiar with this. German and other languages, yes. So if you look around all of the entire world, you will basically find Creole languages based on all colonizing languages. So you will probably find some based on Arabic in Eastern Africa, possibly around the Zanzibar coast. So I think Kenya and that kind of areas. Maybe even Persian, but I'm not quite sure of that. Of course, once again, at some point we get to the question of what is a... Yes, that is indeed dialect continuum is... I think dialect continuum is not quite. This is a case of dialect continuum. But you won't find these kind of tables here. If you look up Creole, you are more likely to find the right one. If you haven't found one by the end of the stream, I'll look it up for you. I'm sure I can find it, but of course it's going to break the flow a little bit. So what did I want to show you? So we saw the English one. The Spanish one no longer functions. This is the French one. Then we had the German one. We looked at this yesterday as well, but there might be someone around who wasn't yesterday. We have, for example, the word Geldbeutel, so the kind of thing that you put your money in, your wallet. This is overwhelmingly called a portemonnaie. This is a French loanword. But in Austria, in particular, you can find Geldtasche, so a money bag. Geldbörse as well in Austria. A different word for bag used with money. In some cases, Brieftasche. This is a briefcase, so a letter bag. I can't identify where this is on the map. Perhaps here north from Erfurt, but I'm not quite sure. Most of these are in the language that they talk about. For example, in this case, the maps are pictures, so Google Translate will not help you. But in the case of the French one, it might help more than with this one. And I know a further one for Italian. In the case of Italian, these are digitized analog maps. If you can speak Italian or French or German, you will be this will be helpful. Geldsack is so direct. Well, it's exactly what it says on the tin. A bag of money. And here you can look up different words and you will have the spread here on the map. For example, here, ora, now, this redirects to money, today. And you have the pronunciation guides for the various parts. Here in Tuscany, we should have something. Domani here, long R, stress on the second syllable. This is the standard Italian variant. For example, going towards Rome is the normal one. If we go, for example, quite far south, here we have Rai. This is probably some kind of a Greek loanword. The southernmost part of Italy used to be filled with Greek colonies in antiquity, and they still retain a number of cultural features that they share with the Greeks. So here on Sicily, we can see Duma. For example, here this is the wave here means that this is a nasal R, so it has swallowed the nasal consonant N. Here we have Romani, where the D as an alveolar stop has been replaced with an alveolar tap, I think, with the dot here. Romani. So these are the distribution maps. And then I also have a couple of databases. The World Atlas of Language Structures is the one that I keep referring to in the slides. This can be interesting as well. If you look up features, you actually have here we are. Here is the explanation of this feature. So if you are interested in specific grammar points, this is a database that you can learn from, in addition to looking up information, whether what the Abaza language, for example, is like. You can see where they're spoken. You can see what kinds of... in this case, there are only 8 data points for this language. For the better ones, you have more than 100. Or you can look up a feature and check, for example, how which languages around the world have small or large consonant inventories. This can be interesting as well. I imagine it is interesting if you are watching my streams. Then we had the ethnographic atlas. No longer saved. So let's just bing it. We looked at this yesterday. So here you can look up, for example, subsistence animal husbandry, which cultures rely on animal husbandry for their sustenance, to which extent, as percentages here. Or again, you can look up a society, say Zulu, and you can find the information about the Zulu society. Yeah, both of these can be quite interesting. And the third one will be Glottolog. If you are interested in how languages are related to each other, this can be a quite interesting database for that. Of course, when it comes to language families, there are often multiple competing hypotheses to them. So what you find here might not be quite the same as what I have taught you. This is simply a case of where we don't actually have perfect information, and I am following the hypotheses that I find most convincing, and the researchers at Glottolog are following different ones. So for example, what languages is Abkhaz related to? And you can find a number of them here. Circassian, for example. These are North Caucasian languages, although you might see that Glottolog does not believe in the North Caucasian languages as a family. An example of the difference between us. You can also look up language families. For example, if you want to find out which languages are Thai-Kadai languages, so related to the Thai language, for example, here you can see them even on the map. So there's quite a number of Thai-Kadai languages in southern China as well. This is actually a topic that the next clip will tackle a little bit. I think that's about it for the databases. If you have further different topics or questions, please feel free to bring them up. But I think that we will start to come to an end slowly. Do they use Chinese script to write those? That's actually a very good question. From the cultural milieu, you might expect them to be written with Chinese letters, but this might not be the case. Thai is written with its own letters. Whether or not those get used in the other languages is a good question. Lin Min Yao, I think. Let's see if we can get that kind of information here. Or let's actually... the problem with these languages is that they are quite small, so we might not actually find any information with Google. But let's look at it. Is this the right one? Let's take a look. Kradai. Kradai is another name for the same language family, so this is the kind of language that we are looking for. So orthography is the one we want. Two main orthographies. It seems that for this language the Latin alphabet is being used. It's just that one of the orthographies is based on the Chinese romanization, and the other one is based on Vietnamese. Vietnamese as written with Roman or Latin letters. Of course, in Vietnam, the Chinese letters were used in the past, so likely to the extent that these languages were written in the in history at all. Again, I forgot the transition. To the extent that these were written at all, they probably were written with Chinese letters in the past. Actually, this transition button is not that useful. I keep forgetting to click it to transition. So anyway, let's stay in the whole screen view. Then, once again, thank you for watching. To everyone watching live and watching and chatting in particular. Of course, this final chat with the extra information that I hope you have found interesting as well could not have taken place without you watching and chatting. Then have a good evening or whatever time of day you have currently. I hope you have enjoyed yourself, and good night.